Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
when I was in college, there was this tiny arcade hidden away in an old mall on the edge of town. It was the kind of mall where half the shops were shuttered, their darkened interiors gathering dust behind for lease signs. The arcade was buried in a corner, a relic of better days when kids would pour in with quarters jangling in their pockets. I'd stumbled across it during my first semester. I was killing time between classes, wandering the mall to escape the November rain, when I saw the flickering neon sign, Retro-K. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and burnt circuitry. The machines hummed quietly, their screens alive with pixelated games. But there was never anyone there, no cashier, no other players. It was eerie, but I liked the solitude. One game always caught my attention, Night Chaser. It sat in the farthest corner, next to a soda machine that hadn't worked in decades. The game's screen showed a low pixelated figure running through a labyrinth, chased by shadowy shapes. No one seemed to play it, it didn't even have a coin slot. But the game was always on, the figure always running. I started visiting regularly, drawn by the strange quiet of the place. One day, while trying to avoid thinking about an upcoming exam, I decided to give Night Chaser a try. When I touched the joystick, the screen flickered and changed. The pixelated figure stopped running and turned toward me, its small face replaced by a flat, black oval. The screen flashed, "Player 1 ready." I should have walked away, but curiosity got the better of me. The joystick felt cold and stiff under my hand. I guided the figure through the maze, dodging the shadows that pursued it. The game wasn't particularly difficult, but the further I got, the more the maze seemed to twist and distort. The walls began to look less like pixels and more like rough, organic textures, like walls of stone or skin. At one point, I swear I heard faint breathing coming from the machine. The game ended abruptly when one of the shadows caught me. The screen flashed, "Player 1 lost." I backed away, my pulse racing, but when I turned, the arcade was different. The humming of the machines had stopped, and the air was colder. The entrance I'd come through was gone, replaced by a blank wall. I was trapped. I called out, but my voice echoed strangely. It felt like the space was too large for the tiny arcade I knew. And then I saw him. A man stood at the back of the arcade, next to the Night Chaser machine. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the hood of a dark sweatshirt. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if waiting. Hello, I managed to croak. He raised a hand and pointed to the machine. The screen flickered, displaying "Player 2 ready." I didn't stay to find out what that meant. I ran to the far end of the room, frantically pushing against the walls, trying to find a way out. Finally, I slammed into a section that gave way, spilling me out into the damp corridor of the mall. When I looked back, the arcade was gone. The corner was empty, just a boarded up storefront with graffiti scrawled across the plywood. I tried convincing myself that the whole experience had been some kind of waking dream, an overstressed brain conjuring up strange scenarios in a half-empty mall. But deep down, I knew better. Something about it had been too vivid, too visceral. Weeks passed, and I threw myself into school to distract myself. It worked for a while. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I doubted anyone would believe me, but even as I tried to push it out of my mind, strange things started happening. It began with a sound. At first, it was subtle, a low hum, almost like white noise, that I'd hear late at night in my dorm. It was faint, but it didn't seem to come from anywhere. No matter how much I moved around the room, it stayed constant, always just at the edge of perception. Sometimes, it was accompanied by a soft, irregular tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on glass. One night, I woke up to the sound of beeping, the same kind of high-pitched tone I'd heard from the arcade machines. When I opened my eyes, I saw nothing unusual, but my laptop was on, its screen displaying nothing but a blank, glowing grid. It wasn't a wallpaper I'd ever used, and no amount of clicking would close it. The words "Player 1 ready" slowly faded onto the screen. I slammed the laptop shut and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Things escalated from there. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, quick, darty shadows that disappeared when I turned my head. Once, while walking back to my dorm after a late class, I saw a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. Tall, thin, wearing a dark hoodie, the same man from the arcade. He didn't move, didn't call out, but I felt his eyes on me. I ran the rest of the way home, my heart pounding. The final straw came a few days later. I was in the campus library, working on a group project with a couple of classmates. We'd booked one of the study rooms, and I was staring at my laptop, trying to focus, when the screen suddenly went black. The grid reappeared, and the words flashed again, "Player 2 ready." My classmates didn't seem to notice. One of them was talking about presentation slides, completely oblivious to the fact that my laptop was no longer functional. When I tried to point it out, out, they just looked at me strangely as though I hadn't spoken. Then, as I stared helplessly at the screen, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned sharply, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. I froze, unable to move. As the words on the screen began to change, "You cannot quit." That was the last time I used my laptop. I stopped going to the library, stopped walking anywhere alone. I tried to explain what was happening to my parents, but they chalked it up to stress. Maybe they were right, maybe I was just imagining things. But I knew the man from the arcade was still out there, watching, waited. It's been years since then. I graduated, moved to a different city, and started fresh. I got rid of the laptop and replaced it with a new one. For a while, I thought I'd finally escaped. But last week, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in years, a faint hum, followed by that unmistakable tapping. When I turned on my new computer, the screen was black. The words were waiting for me. Player 2 ready. Since seeing the words on my screen again, sleep has become a rare luxury. I unplugged my computer immediately, but it didn't make a difference. The words stayed burned into my mind. It felt like they weren't just appearing on the screen anymore, they were etched into the fabric of my existence. I've tried everything to escape this, deleting my accounts, tossing out electronics, even moving across the country again. But wherever I go, he follows. The man from the arcade, always distant but always there. I see him in reflections in store windows or standing under broken streetlights. His presence lingers like a shadow just out of reach, a predator biding its time. A few nights ago, I woke up to the sound of an old arcade game starting up. The chiptune music was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from inside my apartment. I walked into the living room to find my television screen flickering. On it was the familiar grid from Night Chaser, only now the maze looked different. It was no longer abstract pixels, it was detailed, hyper-realistic. The walls looked like the ones in my apartment, cracked paint, the pattern of my wallpaper, even the same framed photo on the wall. The game's figure stood at the maze entrance, and when I blinked, I realized it wasn't the generic, pixelated character anymore. It was May. The screen flashed again, player 1 ready. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I heard the knock at my door. 3 deliberate raps, slow and heavy. I froze, staring at the door. I didn't want to open it, but the knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer, just silence. The third knock came harder, almost like a pounding. Against every ounce of my better judgment, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the peephole. When I looked through, no one was there, just the dim hallway of my apartment building. But something caught my eye, something near my feet. A single toke rested on the floor. It was identical to the ones from the arcade, tarnished brass with the word RETROCAD etched into it. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't pick it up. I slammed the door shut and locked it, retreating to my bedroom with the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I sat on my bed for hours, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. This morning, I finally gathered the courage to check outside. The toke was gone. Now, as I write this, I can feel it watching me. The faint hum is back, louder than ever, filling the room with its electric tension. My laptop, which I've kept powered off for days, turned itself on moments ago. The grid is back on the screen, and the words are flashing again. Final game starting. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I can run anymore. But if you're reading this and you ever see a place called Retrocade, please walk away. Don't touch the machines. Don't enter the maze. This happened a couple of years ago when I was traveling through Europe on a budget. I had found a small hostel in a lesser known town in France, one of those charming places that hadn't yet been completely overrun by tourists. The hostel owner, a friendly woman named Camille, told me about a local flea market that's set up near the old train yard on Ceres. It's small, but you might find something interesting, she said. Intrigued, I decided to check it out. When I got there, the market was just as she described, a few scattered stalls with antique trinkets, handmade jewelry, and secondhand books. It wasn't busy, but the vendors were lively, chatting and laughing with the few visitors. As I wandered from stall to stall, my attention was drawn to an old woman sitting at a table near the back of the market. Her stall was modest, just a few worn items laid out on a dark green cloth. What caught my eye wasn't the items but the woman herself. She had a peculiar presence, with long, silvery hair braided intricately down her back, and she wore an old-fashioned dress that seemed out of place. When our eyes met, she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, it was knowing, as if she'd been expecting me. "Come closer," she said, her voice smooth and low. I hesitated but eventually approached her table. On it were several small objects, a tarnished silver locket, a pair of old spectacles, a cracked porcelain doll, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. "See anything you like?" she asked. I felt a strange pull toward the journal. The leather was scuffed, and the edges of the pages were yellowed, but it looked well loved, like it had a history. "How much for the journal?" I asked. Her smile widened. "Oh, it's not for sale," she said, "but you can have it." I frowned. "I don't understand. Why not give it away. She leaned in closer, her eyes glinting in the late afternoon light. Because it's yours. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? She gestured for me to open it. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The leather was cool to the touch, and the pages felt brittle under my fingers. I flipped it open and froze. My handwriting filled the pages. Notes, sketches, lists, things I had never written, but undeniably mine. My name was scrawled on the first page, written in a way I used to sign it when I was a teenager. How is this possible? I whispered. She tilted her head, as if amused by my confusion. It's always been yours. You just didn't know where to find it. I shoved the journal into my bag and backed away from the table. I don't want it, I stammered. Her smile faltered for the first time. You can't give it back now. Something in her tone sent a chill down my spine. Without another word, I turned and hurried away, weaving through the market stalls until I reached the main road. I didn't stop running until I was back at the hostel. That night, I opened the journal again, desperate to understand what I had taken. The first few pages were filled with things I didn't remember writing, memories that didn't feel like mine. But as I flipped further, the entries became predictive. They described things I hadn't done yet, places I hadn't been, people I hadn't met. I couldn't sleep at night. The next morning, I returned to the market, determined to give the journal back and get answers. But when I arrived, the train yard was empty. No stalls, no vendors, no sign that the market had ever been there. I asked Camille about it later, and she just frowned. What market? There hasn't been a market near the train yard for years. I thought I could ignore the journal. For months, I kept it tucked away on the highest shelf in my apartment, buried under a stack of old notebooks and papers. But it never truly left my mind. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I'd find myself staring at that shelf, feeling the weight of it as though it were calling to me. One night, after a particularly vivid nightmare, I caved. I pulled the journal down and sat at my kitchen table, my hands trembling as I opened it. The first page was the same as before, my name written in that unmistakable teenage scrawl. The pages I had read months ago hadn't changed either. They still detailed events I barely remembered or hadn't yet experienced. But as I flipped further, I noticed something new. Near the middle of the journal, the handwriting shifted. It was still mine, but shakier, more hurried. The entries became less like diary notes and more like warnings. Don't trust the man with the silver ring. Leave before the lights flicker. Do not look behind you. Each phrase sent the shiver down my spine. They felt like fragments of a nightmare I couldn't recall, yet they carried an eerie familiarity. Then I turned to the last page. It was blank, except for a single sentence written in bold, jagged letters. She will come for it. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. Who was she? The old woman at the market? Someone or something else? I couldn't sleep that night. I kept checking my door locks, peering out the window into the dark street below. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. The next day, I decided I needed to get rid of the journal. I threw it in a trash bag, drove to the edge of town, and dumped it in a public dumpster. But when I got home, it was back on my kitchen table as though I had never touched it. This happened 3 more times. No matter what I did, burning it, burying it, throwing it into a river, it always found its way back to me. The final straw came 2 weeks ago. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of pages rustling. The journal was open on the floor at the foot of my bed, its pages flipping wildly as though caught in a strong wind. I froze, unable to move, as words began appearing on the blank pages before my eyes. Shooter. The air grew cold, and the faint scent of lavender filled the room, the same scent I had noticed at the market. I didn't dare look around. I grabbed the journal, shoved it into a drawer, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Since then, strange things have been happening. Lights flicker when I'm alone, and I hear faint whispers in the corners of my apartment. Last night, I woke up to find the journal open again, this time on my bedside table. The writing had changed once more. You can't run forever. I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to confront whatever this is, to find the old woman and demand answers. But a larger part of me, the part that still feels the cold grip of fear from that night, knows it's better to leave it alone. I tried to carry on with my life, but the journal wouldn't let me forget. The whispers grew louder, the lights flickered more frequently, and shadows moved in the corners of my vision. It was as if the air in my apartment was alive with something wrong. One evening, I decided to consult a friend of mine, Daniel, who dabbled in paranormal research. He wasn't exactly a professional, more of an enthusiast, but he had an open mind, and I needed someone to believe me. When I showed him the journal, he was instantly fascinated. This isn't just some random object, he said, flipping through the pages carefully. It feels like a conduit. Something or someone is using this to communicate with you. Can we destroy it? I asked, desperation seeping into my voice. Daniel shook his head, not without understanding what's tied to it. Destroying it blindly could backfire. We need to figure out what it wants or who it's connected to. He suggested a seance, something I was deeply uncomfortable with. But by that point, I was desperate. Anything to break the grip the journal had on my life. We scheduled it for the following Friday night at his place, where he had a small, makeshift ritual room. When the night came, I arrived at Daniel's with the journal tucked under my arm. The air felt heavy, and I had the distinct feeling I was being followed. Daniel had set up a circle of candles, a few protective charms, and an old wooden table where the journal would sit. We started the seance by holding hands and focusing on the journal. Daniel asked the typical questions: who are you? What do you want? Why are you tied to this journal? At first, nothing happened. Then, the flames of the candles began to flicker violently. The room grew icy cold, and a faint, raspy voice whispered from nowhere and everywhere at once: "It belongs to her." Daniel's grip on my hand tightened. "Who is her?" he demanded. The voice responded, louder this time: "She waits." The journal slammed shut on the table, the sound echoing through the room. The candles blew out all at once, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. Where the beam landed on Daniel, his face was pale, his eyes wide. "Something was here," he whispered. "Something powerful." I grabbed the journal and told him I couldn't stay. He didn't argue. As I left, he gave me one last piece of advice: don't open it again. Whatever you do, don't open it. That night, I barely slept. I kept the journal locked in a suitcase, tucked into the closet, but it didn't help. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud banging on my front door. My heart raced as I stumbled out of bed, peering through the peephole. No one was there. The banging stopped, replaced by a new sound: rustling. It was coming from inside my apartment. My stomach dropped as I turned and saw the suitcase on the floor of the living room, the lock broken. The journal was lying open on the floor, its pages flipping wildly. This time, the writing was fresh, scrawled across the pages as if an invisible hand was dragging a pen across them in real time. "Come to the market. She is waiting." The scent of lavender filled the air again, stronger than ever. I backed away, my hands shaking. The journal seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the pages glowing faintly in the dim light. I don't know what to do. I don't even know if I'll make it through the night. But if I disappear, or worse, remember this: if you ever see an old woman at a strange market, don't take what she offers. This happened a few years ago, back when I lived on a small island off the coast. It was a quiet place, just a few hundred residents and one ferry that connected us to the mainland. The ferry ran only twice a day, early morning and late evening. If you missed it, you were stuck until the next day. I was coming back from a work trip and managed to catch the last ferry of the evening. It was late October, and the air was damp and cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. The ferry was nearly empty, save for me, an older couple, and the crew. I decided to stand outside on the deck to enjoy the quiet. The water was black and glassy under the moonlight, and the only sounds were the low hum of the engines and the occasional squawk of a gull. I leaned against the railing, letting my mind wander. That's when I noticed him. A man stood at the far end of the deck, leaning on the railing just like me. I hadn't seen him board, and he hadn't been inside the ferry. He wore a long coat that seemed out of place for the mild weather earlier that day, and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. He was completely still, staring out at the water. Something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he didn't move or the fact that I hadn't noticed him until now. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he just liked the quiet like I did. But then he turned his head slightly, as if he was looking at me, though I couldn't see his eyes. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed. At first, I thought he was pointing at the horizon, but as I followed his line of sight, I realized he was pointing at the water directly below us. I took a step back from the railing, unsure of what to do. "Do something," he asked. His voice was soft, but carried clearly over the distance. "See what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, just kept pointing. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer to the railing and peered over the edge. The water below was dark, reflecting the moonlight in shimmering ripples. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a pale shape just beneath the surface. It swirled and twisted, like a ribbon caught in a current. "What is that?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "It's waiting," the man said. I turned to look at him, but he was gone. I spun around, searching the deck, but there was no sign of him. The ferry wasn't large. There was nowhere he could have gone without me noticing. My pulse raced, and I hurried inside to find the crew. I told them about the man, but they looked at me like I was crazy. One of them even walked the deck with me to check, but there was no one there. When I got back home, I told myself it was just my imagination or a trick of the light, but I stopped taking the last ferry after that. A few months later, I overheard some locals talking about an old legend. They said that years ago, a fisherman had fallen overboard on a stormy night and drowned. His body was never recovered, but people claimed to see a figure on the ferry, always at night, pointing to the spot where he disappeared. The story of the fisherman stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. After hearing it, I started noticing little things that unsettled me. I'd hear whispers about others seeing the same man I had, always on the last ferry, always pointing. They'd tell their stories in hushed tones at the local cafe or during community gatherings, but nobody ever offered an explanation. The worst part, people began noticing strange things happening after their encounters. A woman claimed her boat wouldn't start the next time she went out fishing. Another man said said he lost a night's sleep because he swore he heard knocking on his bedroom window, except his house was miles inland. There were even rumors that someone disappeared after being dared to jump into the water below the ferry at night. By then, I had all but stopped taking the ferry unless it was absolutely necessary. If I had to, I made sure it was the morning run. My coworkers started teasing me about my sudden aversion to the ferry, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to risk another encounter. Then came the night I had no choice. I had stayed too late at a friend's place on the mainland, lost track of time, and missed every other way back to the island. The only option was the last ferry. My stomach churned as I walked toward the dock, the cold October wind whipping against my face. I tried to convince myself I'd be fine. It was just a legend, I told myself, an urban myth to scare locals, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. When I boarded, I noticed it was quieter than usual. There were no other passengers, just me and the crew. The air felt heavier than I remembered, as though the weight of all the stories I'd heard was pressing down on me. I stayed inside, clutching my bag and staring at the floor, trying not to think about it. The hum of the engines was oddly soothing, and for a moment, I almost relaxed. But then I felt it, a change in the air, subtle but unmistakable. It was colder now, the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin but seemed to seep into your bones. I didn't need to look to know. He was there. My heart pounded as I glanced toward the door leading to the deck. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see him standing in the same spot as before, leaning on the railing, pointing. No, I whispered to myself, clutching the arms of my seat. I wasn't going out there. I wasn't going to look. But then, a sound cut through the hum of the engines. It was faint at first, like someone softly tapping on glass. It grew louder and more insistent, and I realized it was coming from the windows near me. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of dark water outside. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, a voice, low and hollow, came from the deck. "Do said." I bolted out of my seat and ran to the crew. They were in the cabin, laughing and chatting, oblivious to my panic. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, but the words caught in my throat. What could I even say? That I was being haunted by a man no one else seemed to see. One of the crew members, a kind older man, noticed my trembling hands and pale face. "You alright, miss?" he asked. I shook my head and pointed toward the deck. "There's someone out there. Heads." He's pointing. The man frowned and exchanged a look with the others. Without a word, he grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. I followed a few steps behind, staying close to the door. He swept the beam of light across the deck, but it was empty. "There's no one here," he said, his voice calm but firm. I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd seen him, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The railing where the man had been standing was drippy wet, as if someone or something had just climbed aboard. I didn't take the ferry for a long time after that. When I finally did, it was in broad daylight, with as many people on board as possible. I still don't know what I saw that night, and maybe I never will. All I know is that I've never want to see it again. Life on the island carried on, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered after that night. The story of the ferryman became an obsession I didn't want but couldn't escape. I combed through every piece of local lore I could find, digging into old newspaper clippings, talking to longtime residents, and even visiting the tiny, damp archives in the town hall. The more I learned, the less comforted I felt. The story of the fisherman who had drowned was real enough, but it wasn't the only tale. Over the decades, there had been whispers of strange occurrences surrounding the ferry and the waters it crossed. A child in the 1960s vanished while playing near the docks. A crew member on the ferry quit suddenly in the 1980s, claiming he'd seen a pale face in the water. And, chillingly, a local diver drowned during a salvage operation, his last words to a colleague reportedly being, "It's trying to pull me under." What was it? No one could agree. Some said it was the restless spirit of the fisherman, while others believed it was something older, something the fishermen of the island had been quietly avoiding for generations. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it. Months passed, and I began to feel a cautious sense of relief. Maybe I just had a vivid, stress-induced hallucination. The ferryman became a story I told only when someone pressed me about why I wouldn't take the last ferry anymore. Most people laughed it off, though a few gave me knowing, uneasy looks. Then, one stormy night, everything changed. I was home, cozying up with a book and a cup of tea, when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the old windows, but as I listened closer, I realized it was coming from the front door. The knock was deliberate, measured. I froze. It was nearly midnight. No one should have been outside, especially not in weather like this. Against every instinct, I got up and approached the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there, just the dark, rain-soaked porch. My heart pounded as I double-checked the locks and backed away from the door. I grabbed my phone, ready to call a neighbor or the police, but before I could dial, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the storm and the faint echo of knocking. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my living room with every light I could manage to turn on, waiting for dawn. By That morning, the power had returned and the storm had passed. I cautiously stepped outside, half expecting to find something, footprints, a sign of whoever had knocked, but there was nothing. Nothing except a small, waterlogged piece of paper lying on the porch. I picked it up with trembling hands and turned it over. Written in shaky, smudged letters were 3 words: "Do say." I dropped the paper and stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut. It was him. It had to be. I don't know how he found me, and I don't know why. I've thought about moving, leaving the island altogether, but I can't bring myself to do it. It feels like running won't help, like whatever this is would just follow me. It started as a typical hike, not down a forgotten trail, but on a well-marked path at a local nature preserve. I was on a short vacation and decided to spend some time outdoors. The trail wound through dense trees, the air crisp and the forest alive with the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves. About 2 miles in, I noticed something odd off the trail. Just beyond a cluster of tall pines was what appeared to be a desk. Yes, a standard office desk, the kind you'd see in a 90 seconds workplace. It was battered, but intact and completely out of place. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the path and made my way to it. The desk was real, scuffed wood, rusty metal handles, and an empty inkwell perched neatly in one corner. A single drawer remained closed, while the others hung open, their contents long gone. Surrounding the desk were what looked like scraps of paper, though they were mostly decayed from exposure. As I got closer, the forest seemed to go eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, just silence. I reached for the closed drawer, my instincts screaming that I shouldn't, but my curiosity overpowered them. The drawer slid open smoothly, unnaturally so, considering the state of the desk. Inside was a stack of photographs. They weren't faded or damaged like you'd expect after sitting in a forest. They were crisp and clear. Each photo was of a different person, men, women, and children standing in front of various landmarks. The Eiffel Tower, a beach, a bustling market. Their faces were all smiling, but something was wrong. The longer I stared, the more the smiles seemed forced. The eyes of... I flipped through the stack, my unease growing. The final photo was a picture of me, not a younger version of me, not one taken by a friend. It was me in the exact outfit I was wearing, standing in front of the desk in the middle of the forest. I dropped the photo and stumbled back. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a desk drawer sliding shut. I turned, and the drawer I had opened was now closed again. The silence of the forest felt suffocating. I didn't wait to see more. I ran back to the trail as fast as I could, the crunch of leaves and twigs under my boots the only noise breaking the stillness. When I reached my car, I hesitated for a moment, looking back toward the trailhead. There was no sign of anything unusual, just the quiet forest. For weeks after the encounter, I couldn't stop thinking about the desk and the photo. It felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting something or someone to show up uninvited. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe it was a prank, maybe I'd been imagining things, or maybe there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew better. One night, about a month later, I was sitting on my couch flipping through TV channels, trying to distract myself. My phone buzzed with a notification, a text from an unknown number. The message contained a single image, the photo of me at the desk. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, frozen, as my phone buzzed again. Another photo. This one was also of me, but it was taken through my living room window. I dropped my phone and scrambled to close the curtains, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp the fabric. I stood there in the dark, listening, waiting. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. No knocks, no footsteps, no signs of anyone nearby. When I finally worked up the courage to check my phone again, the texts were gone, completely erased from my messages as if they'd never existed. I told myself I'd imagined it, but the unease stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, small things started happening. Items in my apartment would be slightly out of place, though I lived alone and was meticulous about where I left things. My keys went missing for hours, only to reappear in the exact spot I swore I left them. Once, I woke up to find my front door unlocked, though I was certain I'd locked it before bed. The breaking point came one evening when I returned home from work. My apartment looked normal at first glance, but as I walked into the living room, I froze. Sitting in the middle of the room was the desk, the same desk from the forest. It looked exactly as it had before, worn and weathered, with the empty inkwell perched on top. The drawer was closed, and I didn't dare touch it. Instead, I turned and bolted out the door, grabbing my keys on the way. I drove to a friend's house, barely able to form coherent sentences as I tried to explain what had happened. When we returned to my apartment later that night, the desk was gone. Nothing else was out of place, but the air felt wrong, heavy. My friend tried to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. I've since moved to a new city, hundreds of miles away, and changed my number. So far, there's been no sign of the desk or the photos, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. It's been over a year since I moved. Life has been quiet, blessedly, almost unnervingly quiet. I've done everything I can to put distance between myself and whatever that desk represented. New city, new job, new routines. I even stopped hiking, something I used to love. It's not worth the risk, but the thing about silence is that it gives your thoughts too much room to grow. No matter how far I run, I can't stop replaying that moment when I saw the photo of myself, or the night the desk appeared in my apartment. I've been careful not to talk about it much, afraid of being labeled paranoid or crazy. But I'm not crazy. I knew what I saw. This morning, something happened that shook me to my core. I was walking to a coffee shop near my apartment when I noticed a man standing on the corner ahead. At first, he seemed like any other pedestrian, just waiting to cross the street. But as I got closer, I noticed he wasn't moving. He wasn't looking at his phone or adjusting his coat. He was staring at me. I slowed my pace, trying not to make eye contact, but something about him kept pulling my attention. He was wearing a dark suit, out of place in the casual neighborhood. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and his eyes. His eyes were the worst part. They were fixed on me, unblinking, like he knew me. As I passed him, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder. He was still standing there, watching. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. It wasn't until I reached the coffee shop that I realized I was shaking. I'd ordered my drink and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. When I left the coffee shop, he was gone, but something was waiting for me instead. Tucked under the windshield wiper of my car was an envelope. No name, no return address, just a plain, white envelope. My first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. Inside was a single photograph. My stomach dropped. It was me, walking to the coffee shop that morning, captured from the perspective of the man on the corner. I haven't been able to stop pacing since I got home. Every sound outside feels like a threat, every shadow a potential danger. I don't know how they found me, or why this is happening, but I know one thing for certain. The desk, the photos, the man, they're all connected, and they aren't finished with me. If anyone reading this ever comes across something that feels wrong, something that doesn't belong, whether it's a desk in the woods, or a stranger who stares too long, don't ignore it. Don't engage. Just leave. I used to work at a small, local ice rink in a town not known for much. It was tucked away in a quiet part of town, a favorite spot for kids and amateur skaters. My job was simple: lock up after the last skaters left and make sure the Zamboni was ready for the next morning. The rink itself wasn't anything special, a big, cold rectangle surrounded by bleachers. But it had a charm, and regulars treated it like a second home. There was one thing about the rink, though, that always struck me as odd: the faint tapping sound you hear late at night when the place was empty. I always figured it was the building settling or maybe water dripping somewhere. It wasn't constant, but it was frequent enough that it became background noise. One winter night, the last skater left later than usual, leaving me alone. I went through my routine, shutting off the lights, checking the doors, and giving the Zamboni a once-over. The tapping started again, but this time it was louder, like someone was knocking on the ice from underneath. I froze, listening. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Knock, knock, hose, knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the center of the rink. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe something was caught in the refrigeration system. Ice expanding, but the sound wasn't mechanical, it was too intentional. I walked to the edge of the rink, my breath visible in the cold air. The sound stopped. I stared out at the empty, glossy surface, illuminated by the dim overhead lights. Nothing moved, but then, faintly, I heard it again, closer this time. Knock, knock. I don't know what possessed me to step onto the ice, but I did. I had my shoes on, so my footing was unsteady, but I carefully made my way toward the center where the sound seemed loudest. As I approached, the tapping stopped completely, replaced by an unnerving silence. That's when I saw it. A small, faint outline beneath the ice, a handprint. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I crouched down, I realized it was too perfect, too detailed. The fingers were spread out as if someone had pressed their hand against the underside of the ice. I scrambled backward, heart racing. That's when the tapping started again, loud and frantic, echoing around the rink. It wasn't just one knock now, it was everywhere. The sound came from all sides, overlapping and growing louder. I bolted for the exit, slipping and sliding as the tapping reached a deafening crescendo. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, engine on and heat blasting. I could still hear the tapping in my ears, like it had imprinted itself on my brain. The next day, I called in sick. I never went back to the rink after that. I couldn't. I never told anyone, either not my boss, not my friends. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that same tapping in my dreams, and I wake up drenched in sweat. A few weeks passed after that night, and I tried to put the incident behind behind me. I told myself it was exhaustion, maybe by my playing tricks on me after too many late shifts. But every time I drove past the rink, my stomach churned. I couldn't shake the image of that handprint perfectly preserved beneath the ice. Then, one morning, I got a call from a coworker, Derek, who still worked there. He sounded shaken. "Hey, have you ever heard anything weird at the rink? Like, noises?" he asked. I froze. I hadn't told anyone about what happened, but his tone made it clear he wasn't joking. "Why, what did you hear?" Derek hesitated before saying, "It's probably nothing. Just some weird knocking sounds. It happened last night when I was closing. I thought it might be the cooling system, but it felt, like it was following me." My blood ran cold. "Did you check the ice?" Silence. Then, "No, why?" I debated whether to tell him, but I didn't want to sound crazy. "Just stay away from the center and don't go alone." That's when he dropped the bombshell. "You know, it's funny you say that. The guy came by the rink yesterday, said he was an old regular, wanted to see the place again. He mentioned something strange, said there used to be a second rink here years ago before it was rebuilt. They drained it after a pipe burst, but some kid went missing around the same time. They never found him." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I didn't know whether to believe him, but it explained too much. The tapping, the handprint, it all started to make a twisted kind of sense. I couldn't let it go. I spent the next few days digging into the town's history, looking for anything about the rink or a missing kid. It wasn't easy, records were sparse, and no one seemed to remember much. But I finally found an old newspaper article from the 1980s. It mentioned a boy named Lucas, age 10, who had vanished after ice skating practice. The rink had been closed temporarily for renovations, but no connection was ever made. The case went cold. Literally, I wanted to tell Derek, but when I called him, his phone went straight to voicemail. Days passed with no word from him, and then I heard through a mutual friend that he'd quit abruptly. He wouldn't say why, but I had a feeling I knew. I wish the story ended there, but it doesn't. Last week, I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that made my skin crawl, tapping. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from outside my bedroom window. I live on the second floor. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I finally mustered the courage to peek through the blinds, and there was nothing. Just the empty street below, bathed in the glow of a street lamp. I don't know if it's my imagination, or if whatever was under the ice has found me, but every night, I sleep with the lights on, and I keep a baseball bat by my bed. After that night, I became hyper-vigilant, constantly on edge. Every little noise made me jump, and I started to feel like I was being watched. It was as if the tapping had left a mark on me, something I couldn't see but could feel everywhere I went. I decided to leave town. It wasn't a rash decision. I'd been wanting to change for a while, and now I had the perfect excuse. I packed up everything I could fit in my car and drove 3 states away to a small town where no one knew me. It was peaceful, quiet, and far from any ice rinks. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even Derek. For a while, he worked. I got a job at a bookstore, made a few friends, and started to feel normal again. The tapping became a memory, something I could almost convince myself had never happened. Almost. A few months after I moved, I went out for drinks with some coworkers. We laughed, shared stories, and I felt lighter than I had in ages. I stayed out later than usual, and by the time I headed home, it was well past midnight. The streets were quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the frost-covered sidewalk. As I approached my apartment building, I noticed something odd. The street lamp outside my building was flickering. It hadn't been like that earlier. I shook it off and headed inside, locking the door behind me. My apartment felt unnaturally cold, but I assumed I'd left the thermostat too low. I turned it up, threw on a sweater, and tried to unwind. That's when I heard it. Delk. My heart stopped. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, coming from the window in my living room. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the window, waiting for something to appear. The knocking stopped, but then, from the other side of the room, I heard it again. Delk. This time, it was coming from the door. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept since that first night and approached the door as quietly as I could. My hands were trembling as I peeked through the peephole. There was nothing there, just the empty hallway. I backed away, heart racing, and that's when I noticed something. My breath was visible. It was freezing, even though the thermostat read 72 degrees. Then I saw it, a single handprint on the inside of the window, the same size and shape as the one I'd seen under the ice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my bedroom with the lights on, clutching the bat, waiting for the sun to rise. When it did, the handprint was gone, and the room was warm again, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. It wasn't over. Since then, the tapping has followed me. It's not every night, but it's frequent enough to remind me that I'm not safe. I've tried to research ways to protect myself, salt lines, prayers, even reaching out to paranormal experts, but nothing works. I've stopped making friends or getting close to anyone. I'm afraid whatever this is will latch onto them too. My life is a cycle of fear and exhaustion, and I don't know how much longer I can take it. A few months ago, I started a side hustle restoring vintage furniture. I'd often scour estate sales or old shops looking for hidden gems. One Saturday morning, I found myself in a peculiar little shop tucked into the corner of an old industrial district. The sign above read J. Edgar's Stationery and Antiques. Inside, the shop felt much larger than it appeared from the outside. It was dimly lit, with towery shelves stacked haphazardly with everything from typewriters to leather-bound journals. I was the only customer, and an elderly man behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper. As I wandered, I spotted an antique writing desk against the back wall. It was beautiful, with delicate carvings along its edges and a slight patina that gave it character. But what drew me to it most was its price, only $30. The shopkeeper barely reacted when I dragged the desk up to the counter, aside from muttering, "Good luck with that one." Curious, I inspected the desk more closely once I got home. The craftsmanship was incredible, but one drawer was stuck. I pulled and twisted at it to no avail. Assuming it was warped from age, I decided to leave it for later. That night, I had a strange dream. I was sitting at the desk, but the room around me wasn't my workshop. It was an old, candlelit study with high ceilings and shadowed corners. In the dream, I was furiously writing something, but I couldn't see the paper. I woke up unsettled, but brushed it off as a side effect of binging creepy podcasts. The next morning, I tried the drawer again. This time, it slid open with an unexpected ease that nearly knocked me backward. Inside, I found an old, folded piece of paper. The writing was faint and smudged, but I could just make out the words, "Finish what you started." I stared at it for a long time, a chill running down my spine. What did that even mean? I hadn't started anything. I tried telling myself it was probably some joke or forgotten scrap left by the desk's previous owner, but over the next few days, the desk started to feel wrong. No matter where I moved it, I'd catch its reflection in windows or mirrors and swear the drawer was open, just a crack, when I hadn't touched it. One night, while working late, I heard a noise from my workshop, a scraping sound. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. The drawer of the desk was fully open, and the piece of paper was lying on the floor. This time, the words had changed. "Don't leave." I packed up the desk and drove it back to the shop the next morning. The elderly shopkeeper looked up when I walked in, a slight smirk curling his lips. "Didn't take you long," he said, wheezing out a laugh. "What is with this thing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "It finds people like you," he said cryptically, "people with unfinished business." I left the desk in the shop and walked out without another word. Weeks later, I tried to return to the area to confirm what had happened, but the shop wasn't there. The spot was empty, as if it had never existed. The absence of the shop gnawed at me for weeks. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to convince myself it had been a bad dream or some elaborate trick. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was one thing I couldn't shake, the feeling that I'd been chosen somehow. I tried to move on, and I threw myself into my work, restoring more furniture, doing my best to avoid pieces with drawers. But strange things kept happening. I'd wake up to the sound of scratching in my workshop, even though nothing was out of place. Objects on my desk would move overnight, a pencil rolling off the edge, papers fluttered as though a breeze had passed through. Once, I woke up to find my laptop open, a blank document on the screen. The cursor blinked as though waiting for me to type something. The dreams returned, too. I'd find myself at the desk again, writing furiously, but now the paper was visible. The words were nonsensical, scrambled letters, symbols, and shapes, but my dream self seemed desperate to get them down. When I woke up, I'd feel drained, like I'd actually been working through the night. Then, a package arrived at my door. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in messy handwriting. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a single item, the desk drawer. It was unmistakably the one from the antique desk I'd returned to J. Edgar's, down to the carvings on the handle. I felt sick. How had it found me? Andrew said to. I threw it into my trunk, drove out to a remote wooded area, and tossed it into a ravine. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. But the next morning, the drawer was back. It sat in the center of my workshop, a silent, accusing presence. This time, the paper inside bore a new message. It's time. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't ignore the sense that something was building, like a storm on the horizon, just out of sight but growing closer. I started to hear whispers when I was alone, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakable. Sometimes I thought I caught my own name. One night, the power went out while I was in the workshop. In the pitch darkness, the whispers grew louder, circling me, overlapping until they were an unbearable cacophony. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, it wasn't the workshop I saw. I was back in the candlelit study from my dreams. The desk was there, waiting for me. A piece of paper and a quill sat on its surface. I didn't want to sit down, but my legs moved on their own, dragging me toward the chair. My hands reached for the quill, trembling as they began to write. This time, the words were clear. You cannot run from what you owe. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my workshop, my hands covered in black ink. The drawer was gone. Since then, I felt like I'd be watched, even in my own home. Sometimes I'll catch movement out of the corner corner of my eye, a shadow slipping around a corner, the faint shape of a figure in a window. I've stopped working on furniture altogether, but the whispers haven't stopped. I don't know what I owe, or to whom, but I'm afraid that one day I'll find out. After that last encounter, I was too terrified to stay in my home. I packed a bag with the essentials, threw it into my car, and drove with no real destination in mind. I just needed to get away, to outrun the shadows I felt creeping ever closer. Every turn of the wheel felt like a temporary reprieve, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. The whispers weren't bound by geography. They followed me. In motel rooms, gas station restrooms, even crowded diners, I'd hear faint murmurs, the same unintelligible hisses that now felt like a cruel joke. Sometimes, I thought I caught the word return, spoken in that guttural tone that raised every hair on my body. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled into a truck stop and sat in my car, trying to steady my breathing. I opened my phone and searched for information on J. Edgar's shop, hoping for some clue, but there was nothing. No website, no business listing, not even a historical record. It was as if the place had never existed. As I scrolled in frustration, a new notification popped up on my screen, an email with no subject line, from an address I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The message was just one line: "You can't run forever." Attached was a photo. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. It was a picture of me, taken from behind the wheel of my car at that very truck stop. I twisted in my seat, heart pounding, scanning the lot for anyone with a phone or camera, but there was no one. That night, I decided to face whatever this was head on. I couldn't keep running. If I was being haunted, hunted, or whatever this was, I needed answers. I drove back to where I'd first found the shop, though I knew it would probably be futile. Sure enough, the lot was empty, just cracked asphalt and tufts of weeds where the building had stood. I sat in my car, staring at the emptiness, wondering what to do next. And then I heard it, a deep, resonant creak, like would be pushed open. I turned toward the sound and froze. The shop was there, fully intact, its weathered sign swinging gently in the wind. The light inside was dim, but it glowed faintly, beckoning me. I didn't want to go inside, but my body seemed to move on its own. The door opened before I could reach for it, and a rush of stale, musty air hit me. The interior looked exactly as I remembered: the towering shelves, the cluttered aisles, the faint scent of old paper and varnish. At the back of the shop, the desk stood waiting. The elderly shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was a figure I hadn't seen before, standing motionless in the shadows. Its features were obscured, but its presence was suffocating. "Why me?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it gestured toward the desk. I knew what it wanted. With trembling legs, I approached the desk and sat down. The quill and paper were waiting for me, just as they had been in my dreams. My hands moved without my consent, picking up the quill and dipping it into the ink. The words that flowed from me this time weren't mine. They spilled out in a language I didn't recognize, a script that looked ancient, looping, and sinister. The air around me grew colder with every stroke of the pen, and I felt like something was being pulled from inside me, something vital. When the last word was written, the paper ignited, burning away in an instant without leaving a trace. The desk, too, began to crumble, the wood splitting and splintering as if it had waited centuries to fall apart. I bolted for the door, not looking back. When I turned around in the parking lot, the shop was gone again. It's been weeks now. The whispers have stopped, and I haven't had any more dreams. But every now and then, I catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, the faint sound of wood creaking. I don't know what I gave that thing, and I'm terrified to find out. About a year ago, I got a seasonal job at a remote observatory. My role wasn't glamorous. I wasn't analyzing the stars or working with astronomers. I was just the night technician, ensuring the equipment functioned, the temperatures stayed regulated, and everything remained clean for the scientists who'd arrive in the morning. The observatory was perched on a mountain, surrounded by a thick blanket of mist and silence. Nights were uneventful, save for the occasional owl or rustle of the wind through the trees. Most of my time was spent in the control room, a circular space with computers, monitors, and large windows that offered an endless view of the dark sky. One particularly quiet night, I was alone in the control room, staring out into the blackness. The observatory's equipment hummed softly, almost hypnotically. I had just finished logging some data and was about to grab a snack when I noticed something odd on one of the external cameras. The observatory had a few security cameras positioned around its perimeter to deter wildlife and monitor weather conditions. On one of the feeds, I saw movement, a faint, flickering shadow crossing the lower part of the screen. It wasn't an animal, It moved too smoothly, almost like a person. I leaned in, squinting at the monitor. The figure appeared to be walking toward the main entrance. The building was locked, and as far as I knew, no one else was scheduled to be here that night. Thinking it might be a lost hiker, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the door. When I stepped outside, the cold mountain air hit me, and the silence was deafening. My flashlight beam cut through the mist, but there was no sign of anyone. I called out, "Hello, do you need help?" No response. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Back in the control room, I rewound the footage, hoping to figure out where the figure had gone. But when I played it back, the screen was blank, no movement, no shadow, nothing. It was as if the figure had never been there. I brushed it off as a glitch or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But an hour later, the power flickered, the hum of the machine stuttered, and the lights dimmed for a split second before everything returned to normal. I checked the equipment, but nothing seemed out of place. That's when I saw it. On the far window of the control room, there was a faint outline of a handprint. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. The glass was cold, and the print seemed to have been made from the outside. I froze, my mind racing. There was no way someone could reach that window. It was on the second floor, and there was no ledge or access point. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the control room, every light on, clutching my flashlight and staring at the monitors. The handprint stayed there until dawn, fading as the sunlight hit the glass. The following morning, I reported the incident to my supervisor, but they brushed it off as a prank or an overactive imagination. I stayed for the remainder of the season, but I never felt alone in the observatory again. After that night, the observatory didn't feel the same. What once felt serene and isolating now felt oppressive and unnervingly watchful. I tried to shake the unease, convincing myself that I'd been overtired, that my imagination had gotten the best of me, but the little signs kept adding up. One night, about a week after the handprint incident, I noticed something else strange. As I made my rounds, I heard a faint tapping sound, like something tapping on glass. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a loose cable brushing against the side of the building, but the sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the telescope dome itself. The dome was massive, housing the main telescope, and was accessible only by a spiral staircase locked at the bottom. No one but authorized personnel had the key, and I was the only one there that night. I hesitated, heart pounding, before climbing the stairs to investigate. As I reached the top, the tapping stopped. The room was deathly silent except for the low mechanical hum of the telescope's motors. I scanned the room with my flashlight. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavy, like I was being watched. Then, as I turned to leave, I saw it, another handprint, this time on the inside of the dome's observation window. It was larger than the one on the control room window, smeared slightly as if whoever made it had dragged their fingers down the glass. I backed away slowly, heart racing, and locked the door behind me as I left. I didn't go back to the dome for the rest of my shift. The final straw came a few nights later. I was in the control room, trying to distract myself with work, when the sound of static crackled over the intercom system. The observatory wasn't equipped with a functioning POS system, at least none that I had ever used. The static grew louder, punctuated by faint, garbled whispers. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the tone was low, almost pleading. I stared at the speaker, frozen. Suddenly, the static stopped, replaced by a single, clear word, leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my things and left the observatory that night, not bothering to finish my shift. I didn't even bother clocking out. I drove down the windy mountain road as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I quit the next day, telling my supervisor I couldn't handle the isolation anymore. I didn't mention the handprints, the whispers, or the tapping. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I also didn't want to stay in that place another second. To this day, I don't know what I experienced at the observatory. Maybe it was all in my head, a result of too many long nights and too much coffee, or maybe something else was up there with me, something that didn't want me there. I didn't think much about the observatory for months after I quit. I avoided mentioning it to anyone, even close friends, afraid of how ridiculous it might sound. But as time passed, little things began to creep back into my life, things that reminded me of those nights on the mountain. It started small. At home, I'd hear faint tapping on my apartment windows late at night, even though I lived on the third floor. Once, I convinced myself it was a bird, but when I looked out, the window was clear except for a faint smudge, as though someone, or something, had pressed their hand against it. I shrugged it off as coincidence, I told myself, but then I started hearing static in the middle of the night. It wasn't on my TV or my phone. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like a distant whisper carried on the air. Then the dream started. In these dreams, I was back in the observatory. The control room was bathed in dim red light, and the monitors flickered erratically. I'd feel the same oppressive weight, like I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. The dreams always ended the same way, with me looking at the large telescope's dome and seeing a figure staring at me from the observation window. Its face was obscured, but its hand pressed against the glass was unmistakable. One night, I woke up from the dream, drenched in sweat, and immediately noticed the faint scent of cold metal in the air, just just like the control room of the observatory. My stomach churned as I realized the tapping on my bedroom window had returned. This time, it was steady and deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. Terrified but unwilling to stay frozen in bed, I grabbed my phone and flashlight and approached the window. My hands trembled as I peeled back the curtain. There was nothing there, but on the glass, clear as day, was a handprint, larger than my own. I couldn't stay in my apartment that night. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly for hours, ending up at a well-lit diner on the edge of town. I stayed there until sunrise, the dream and the handprint replaying in my mind. Desperate for answers, I contacted one of the astronomers from the observatory, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Calloway. He was surprised to hear from me but agreed to meet for coffee. I didn't tell him everything, only that I'd experienced strange things while working there. Dr. Calloway went quiet, his face pale. He confessed that I wasn't the first to report odd occurrences at the observatory. Staff had complained for years about strange noises, equipment glitches, and shadows in the corners of their vision. But what disturbed me most was when he mentioned the history of the observatory. Decades ago, during the observatory's construction, a worker had fallen from the dome while performing maintenance. The death was ruled an accident, but some staff believed the worker's spirit lingered, tied to the place where his life had ended so abruptly. Hearing this, I felt a chill run down my spine. The handprints, the tapping, the whispers, could they all be connected to this worker's restless spirit? Or was it something else entirely, something darker? Dr. Calloway suggested I let it go and try to move on, but the truth is, I'm not sure I can. Whatever followed me from that observatory doesn't feel like it's ready to let me go. Now, every so often, I wake up in the middle of the night, feeling that same oppressive weight I felt in the control room. I never open my windows anymore, no matter what I hear outside. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.